Hey everyone, how you doing? So, Plants vs. Zombies in the early years. It is certainly a very interesting topic to discuss, and seeing as how I've already made 2 entire videos discussing some of the early titles, it's not hard to see why that is. Early PvZ was just one of those things where you really had to be there to truly understand how big it was. And with that being said, I think it's about time we move on from that chapter of PvZ's life. So for those unfamiliar with what I'm talking about, welcome to a retrospective series I'm making where I review and discuss every major PvZ title that was released internationally. And if you saw the title of this video, well, you know what to expect. So today, we will be going over what is possibly the best or weakest game in this franchise, depending on how you look at it. And its name is PvZ 2, It's About Time. Now, before we actually get into what this game is all about, we need to do a bit of a background check here. So PvZ 2's subtitle really is fitting despite how dated it feels nowadays. See, PvZ 1 came out in 2009, and PopCap really took their time with making this game, so in that context, it's pretty fitting. Now, as for what happened behind the scenes of the game, there were a couple of changes here that got some people concerned when they noticed them. The biggest changes by far were George Fan, who was the lead designer for PvZ 1, leaving PopCap, and more importantly, EA buying PopCap. Now listen, I'm not one of those people who are going to go on a big rant about this acquisition. In fact, I'm actually somebody who is even willing to say that this purchase was good for PopCap, at least at first. But we can't ignore what we eventually saw with this franchise, and unfortunately, this is something that ended up hurting PopCap in ways that we wouldn't understand until later down the line. But we'll get there when we get there. So with the basics out of the way, I'll be formatting this video's contents in the same way that I have with the other games in this franchise. Story, gameplay, extras, and endgame/completion. And with that list here, we'll start from the top, that being PvZ 1's story was quite simple. Actually, it was very simple and nearly non-existent. Here though, we actually have a plot. Wait, what? Okay, so here's the basic rundown of what we're doing. Crazy Dave is back, and this time around he eats a taco. Yes, a taco kicks off the story here. But wait, hold on, let's see what he thinks. Okay, so he likes this taco so much to the point where he feels the need to go back in time to eat it again. And he accomplishes this with a new friend, Penny the Talking Car. Okay, this is a lot. But honestly, the more you try to rationalize it, the more you realize that this is a game about plants fighting zombies, and it's just a headache. So once you go back in time, because frick it, they're bringing you too and you better like it, the gang ends up in a completely different time period compared to just a few moments ago. So now the goal is to get Dave's taco back, and this time around, you have to get through these worlds stuck in the past and present. Oh, and Zomboss is back too. That's neat, I guess. Alright, so the story here is definitely way more developed, and I like that. However, now that I've explained the plot, I just realized how stupid it is. That is PopCap's fashion, so we're just gonna go with it. Obviously, we will save the conclusion on the story for later, so let's just move on to the meat of the game, which is PvZ 2's gameplay. Oh, I love this. Oh my god, where do I even begin? Okay, so I think it's important to highlight what made the original PvZ so enjoyable to play in the first place, and that was its gameplay loop. You built a defense that protects your house against the horde, and this was typically achieved by learning how to counter specific zombies and such. The gameplay never really got old because you were constantly facing new threats and earning new plants too. There's a lot of fun to be had here. And at a basic level, I think PvZ 2 does all of this and more better. PvZ 2's gameplay loop is identical, but there's a lot of new changes here that make things feel better, at least in my opinion. Let's start with the general quality of life changes that you might have noticed immediately. First of all, yes, I am a diehard speed button fan, how'd you know? This was added in a Chinese PvZ game first, and I guess PopCap liked it there so much that they felt like it would be a good addition here too. And they were right. This makes life so much easier. There's also a new sun meta here too. In PvZ 1, the amount of sun that came from the sky and sunflowers was 25, but here it's 50. This makes PvZ 2 pretty easy in comparison to PvZ 1, at least when you first start playing. This game gets tough, which is something that I can't really say as confidently about PvZ 1. On top of these changes, we also now have power-ups. These are pretty basic, and you only really need to use them if you're struggling, but it's neat that you have this choice now. Still pretty pointless, but hey look, I'm throwing snowballs at zombies. I like this. Also, I use these in my playthrough due to something we'll discuss later. Oh, and one final small change I want to discuss here is that we now have plant families too. Basically, all of the plants in this game are sorted into families, and this is actually used in a game mode that we'll discuss later. Though even without that, it's still a very much appreciated change. Now, these changes are quite nice, but now we gotta get into the major stuff, and I couldn't think of a more fitting place to start than plant food. What if Gatling Pea was a temporary buff? Well, that question must have been on the minds of PopCap's dev team because we got an answer to that very question. Plant food works in a pretty unique way. Typically, the way you get this stuff is by killing a glowing zombie. Once you do so, you can pick up the plant food and put it on pretty much any plant you want. Almost every plant in the game besides instant use ones will have some kind of special ability when you feed them. And these abilities range wildly on a plant by plant basis too. Hey look, Walnut has armor now. Whoa, that potato mine just duplicated. And oh my god, it's a shower of pain. Now, plant food is a really neat idea, but with it comes a new set of challenges for the player, such as thinking about when and where you want to use this stuff. Sometimes you only get 2 or 3 per level, and in those cases, it can definitely be a hassle to manage. But honestly, I think that's what makes the system fun and not borderline boring. Because believe me, a mechanic of this caliber can and will break the game if you aren't careful. We'll get to that. Anyways, there's one more major gameplay change that you might have noticed here, and that is the levels being notably shorter in this game. That's mostly due to the sheer amounts of them. Like, we're working with over 200 levels. Yeah, I think some shortening was bound to happen. That is a lot. So that's pretty much all of the new permanent changes in this game, but we didn't cover any of the meat yet. And oh man, this is where things get wild. So because you were constantly hopping through different time periods, it's clear that PopCap had a vision of what they wanted us to see in this game, as now there's a lot of new stage gimmicks, new plants, and new zombies. I can't possibly cover all of this, so instead I think I'll use the first world as an example. That world would be ancient Egypt, and this one area shows us just how much PopCap crammed this game with. Starting with the new stage gimmicks, we now have Wind Gusts, which is almost like a bungee raid from PvZ1, but this one is a little easier to deal with. We also have tombstones here, which really suck, but they're interesting. Oh, and there's also new stage types too. As an example, this level is a Last Stand level. 10 years later, and this still shocks me. It's awesome. For the new plants, we have stuff like Bok Choy, which is a melee plant that is simply not very good, but it's still pretty cool. Bloomerang is also new face, and this one can pierce its shots through multiple targets. Though I have to say my favorite new addition here is Iceberg Lettuce, which is basically a potato mine that freezes zombies while doing no direct damage to them. Stalling plants, my beloved. Finally, we have the new zombies, and this is where PvZ2 really shines. For every new plant I mentioned, there is a zombie parallel for them. Bok Choy gets immediately killed by the Torch Zombie, which is a speedy guy that burns any plants in front of him. Bloomerang's competition is the Camel Tile Zombies, which are a straight shooting plant's worst nightmare. And Iceberg Lettuce has, I guess, the Sarcophagus Zombie? Maybe? Okay, that one's a stretch, but I've made my point here already. The new changes are quite interesting. And believe me, we have barely scratched the surface. You want some more examples? Sure. Pirate Seas introduces the idea that maybe we don't need all 5 lanes, and the zombies adapted to that using seagulls, ropes, and sometimes even cannons. Plants also adapted here by being able to stop the zombies who want to cross, like Colonel Polt's butter dropping seagulls. Jumping a little ahead here, Frostbite Caves introduces blizzards, which freeze plants. The zombies already adapted, so it's up to us to figure out how we can overcome this hurdle. I personally use Pepper Pulp because I frankly feel bad for the guy. And if you really want to get serious with level gimmicks, how about we just make the first few lanes water? Well, Big Wave Beach does this, and it is rough, I'll tell you that much. Now, do you see my point on how much crazier this game is? Seriously, it's jam-packed with new gimmicks. And the best part about all of this is that it feels fresh. Yes, there are returning stage gimmicks and plants and zombies too, but there is just as much, if not more, new content. And even the stuff that does return more often than not has a new spin on it as well. There is so much here to talk about. Now, before we move on to some of the negatives, I'd like to briefly discuss the boss fights too. There's really no reason to save this for the end of the video, so we'll talk about it now. At the end of every world, Zomboss builds a robot to take you down, and your goal is to stop him at all costs. These levels are more or less just the Zomboss fight from PvZ1 with new gimmicks. And honestly, I'm okay with that. If you consider how there's over 10 boss fights in this game, it's definitely forgivable since these fights are also pretty difficult if you don't know what you're doing. I feel so bad for the poor souls who did not understand the Frostbite Caves mammoth fight. Yikes. Okay, so up to this point, I've been pretty generous with this title, but now it's time to talk about its issues. And yeah, PvZ2 unfortunately has a lot of those. Let's start off with the one that most people do not shut up about, and that is the microtransactions. So this game is free to play, and you already know what that means. Money. It's honestly not as much of a problem as people say it is, but it's still very, very annoying. The fact that I have never once used Chomper in an actual playthrough because it costs $5 is beyond ridiculous. Thankfully, you can play and enjoy this game without ever having to spend a cent on it. I mean, look at my legitimate account here. I have most ancient Egypt plants near max normal level, which I just find to be funny. Oh, and that reminds me. Do you remember how I made a remark about poorly implemented mechanics potentially breaking the game? Yeah, so plant leveling. This was technically a mechanic in the original game, but it was never a permanent upgrade. And even then, it wasn't straightforward either. But in PvZ2, every upgrade plant was either turned into a separate plant, or they simply didn't come back at all. No, here PopCap decided to make the game stupidly easy for late game players. So you can level up your plants via seed packets, and once you collect a certain amount of them due to completing levels or buying them from the shop, you get to level up your plants. Now here's the thing, this game wasn't built for plant leveling at all, and it is really obvious once you start getting into the higher levels. Though frankly, even the lower levels make a difference here. Like, take Bowling Bulb as an example. This plant is honestly not all that good at level 1, but by level 3, it becomes much stronger. And for one specific level in Big Wave Beach, the difference between those two becomes very obvious very quickly. It's kind of crazy once you see it in action, and honestly, this feature kinda stinks. I wish PopCap handled it differently because leveling seriously breaks the adventure. It's honestly one of my least favorite aspects of this game simply because it wasn't here since the beginning, so it's not something that the game was built around, making it feel pretty cheap in certain events. One more complaint I want to talk about here is a minor one, but it's something that I have to address, otherwise people are probably gonna get mad at me. So yes, we're gonna talk about the evolution of plants in this game. Alright, so you may have noticed it at this point, but I have been almost exclusively showing footage of the campaign plants only, and that's for a good reason. While the campaign plants and most of the early roster are all fairly solid, the further along we get into the game's life, the more you begin to notice a trend, and it's a declining one at that. Notice the quality of Blooming Heart here. She was released at some point around 2016, which was when PvZ2's adventure was wrapping up. She looks pretty normal and in the style of the other PvZ2 plants. Now take a look at Maybe, a plant released earlier this year, 2023. The difference in art style and even animation is crazy. There was clearly a decline, and it's hard to not notice. Now, that being said, this is obviously not entirely PopCap's fault. Like, you try to update a game for 10 years while keeping a consistent style. Yeah, that's not gonna happen, simply put. But still, the difference between plants that were made in 2016 and plants being made nowadays is very noticeable. Okay, now we've addressed it, and that wraps up gameplay stuff. I know this section was all over the place, but it's kind of hard to pin down what counts as gameplay and what counts as extras. So expect more chaos in our next section here, that being PvZ2 has a lot of extra content, so where do I begin? Well, I suppose we'll start with the stuff that helps you in the main adventure. First of all, the Zen Garden returns, and this time around, it's actually useful for something besides coins. Yes, you can still plant marigolds, but you can also now get boosts if you grow random plants too. Ooh, that's nice. These boosts work in a pretty cool way too. Whenever you hop into a level, you can use the boosted plant, and every time you place them down, they use their plant food. That's just neat. And it's also another way to increase potential monetization because you could speed this process up. Yeah, whatever, you get the idea. We also have a new shop here too. Gone are the days of Twitty Dingles, as that shop closed its doors down to make a new one that is full of microtransactions. Look, I love PvZ2, but I'm not gonna lie, 99% of this shop is just promotions. It's not ideal, but if you really want to, you could always get some of this stuff. Not a good idea for your wallet, but yes, it is here. Though actually, this does segue into something else that I didn't feel like I could fit in the gameplay section, that being the new purpose for gems. Instead of being 1,000 coins per pickup, these are now their own currency. And this currency can be used in a store for seed packets, or if you save up enough, new plants entirely. These are all useful to some extent, and I am somebody who likes all of them. My personal favorite is Homing Thistle. Yes, I am coping with the loss of Cattail in this game, why do you ask? Oh, and one more thing here, costumes. Plant costumes are now a thing, and they are awesome. That's all I gotta say. Anyways, now we'll move on to the actual content, and starting off here, we've got quests. So there's this new friend called the travel log, and this log gives you rewards for doing different tasks, as well as challenges for more rewards. There's a lot that we could talk about here, but for the sake of brevity, the only thing I'll mention is that this log frequently gives you opportunities to play around with plants that you don't own, which is pretty awesome. We also have to mention the daily levels too. So every day a new daily level drops, and these are almost kind of in a rotation. Like once you've played enough of them, you can kind of tell which one is which, but these are also interesting. If you complete enough of them, you earn coins and other stuff like seed packets. It's kind of neat. Moving forward here, we've got everyone's favorite game mode returning from PvZ1, Vase Breaker. Where's iZombie? Okay, all jokes aside, yes, we do have Vase Breaker, and it's very, very meh. But it's here for those of you who want it, so there you go. I'm sorry, I treat Vase Breaker like I treat PvZ3. If you don't have anything good to say about it, then don't say anything at all. Alright, now we're gonna get into the biggest remaining extra content, and these game modes are quite unique. The first one is Penny's Pursuit, a game mode where Crazy Dave gets kidnapped by Zomboss, and you help Penny get him back by playing through wildly different custom levels that change weekly. There's a lot of challenges to get through, but once you get through them, you enter a high score version of a Zomboss fight, which I've always found to be really neat. It's a very unique take on these fights, and it makes things interesting. The rewards for this game mode are mostly seed packets, so don't expect anything too wild here, but regardless, it's really cool stuff. The final piece of content that we're covering in this section is the arena mode, and this is a really cool idea. Basically, this mode is all about racking up as many points as you can in a time limit given to you. Now that's pretty simple, but there's a couple of catches here. First of all, this is ranked, which means that you are actually competing against real people, kind of. It's actually just replays of other people's games from what I've heard, but that's still cool. There's also different challenges and such in this game mode that rotate frequently too. Like sometimes your straight shooting plants can't do anything because the game just says they can't. Or sometimes your piercing plants will do bonus damage, because why not? That's not all with this mode though. You're doing all of this for a reason, and that's where the new plants step in. Using this mode, you can actually unlock the newest plants in the game by simply winning matches. It's pretty neat, though this mode does run off of an energy-like system where you can't play too many matches or else you'll need to buy more gauntlets. Oh yeah, the PopCap way. There's also a couple of other incentives here too. Since this is a ranked mode, there's different tiers that you can get to, which give you other rewards like gems. Oh, and one final thing here is that you also get mints from the rewards sometimes. These mints can be used to buy a special plant type that's tied to the plant families in this game, those being mints. These plants boost all plant family members on the field for a few seconds, while also providing their own unique powers too. Needless to say, these plants are pretty broken, but regardless, they are still really neat. So that's about all I can cover in this section. And with all of that extra content out of the way, now we'll finally move on to Alright, so this is where PvZ2 is a bit of a make or break for some people. I think the endgame here is both really good and really mediocre at the same time, but in order to see why, we need to first go over to the final world in this game. Modern day is where we find ourselves at the end of all the time hopping, and this world is chaotic. It brings back gimmicks and zombies from just about every other world in the game, and Zomboss is not holding his punches anymore. You see some of the most annoying zombies almost immediately, stuff like Octozombie. But on top of that, there's also sometimes random portals that pop up in the middle of the lawn that just send in even more zombies. It's quite stressful, even for someone like me who's played a lot of this game. Now, to compensate for this chaos, we also have new plants that aid us too. These are all shadow plants, and these plants are all decent on their own, but if they're near a moonflower, the sunflower equivalent for these plants, that's where things get good. All of these plants get massive buffs, especially Dusklobber, which is arguably one of the best plants in the adventure. On top of this, we also get some heavy nostalgia throughout this world too. All-Star, Newspaper, and even Balloon Zombies all make a return, and we even get Beghouled as one of the level gimmicks here. Huh, that is really weird, but I don't mind it. Now, once you get further and further into the world, the difficulty really begins to pick up. But once you reach Zomboss, things take a turn for the weird. Zomboss has 3 fights waiting for you, but all of these fights are both unique and also not really unique. Let me explain. They're unique in the sense that they are randomly generated, but they're not unique because they're fights you've already done just with a new set of plants. That is a really weird note to end on because it feels very unfinished. I mean, it's not unfinished, but to a certain extent, it might as well be. It's just odd to have a massive build up towards Zomboss only to see that his final fights are nothing more than variations of past fights. But once you blaze through these fights, you win the greatest taco known to man, and Dave was happy. But yeah, that's PvZ2's campaign. It has a weird ending, but I guess the journey is what matters in the end, and not necessarily the ending. Still though, I highly recommend playing this game regardless of who you are. This game is genuinely really fun, and it pains me to see so many people still hate it just because they don't like paying for a few plants that they might not have wanted to use in the first place. It is what it is, but hey, you watched until the end, so I'm sure you're interested in this topic. And since you're here, I'd like to hear your thoughts on PvZ2 in the comments down below. I read my comments, I promise. Also, if you're new around here and you like what you see, then maybe consider subscribing, as it helps me out a ton. Now I'm actually about to turn 19, so I'm gonna go celebrate that. Peace.